بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. In the previous video, I traced America's self-image of exceptionalism to the Bible, more specifically to the concept of the chosen people of God or the chosen nation of God, which of course in the Hebrew Bible is applied to the Israelites, ancient Israelites. Now, this particular concept has actually become the foundational, one of the main foundational doctrine of genocide, ethnic cleansing, and settler colonization. It was applied first in America by the early settlers there who came from Europe, and of course more recently in Palestine. Now, I would like to stress here that this particular concept doesn't actually need to be abused in this way, but it is open to abuse and has been abused, and it is probably more open to abuse than any other religious concept, I would think. And in this video, I will be touching on the concept of chosenness rather indirectly, but and maybe discuss it in more detail in a future video. My focus, the emphasis of this video will actually be on the concept of the covenant to Abraham. The Abrahamic covenant is actually the foundation of the concept of chosenness in the Hebrew Bible. So I'm going to focus on this video in this particular concept. And I will be showing, first I'll deal with this concept in the Bible. I will show how this concept, the covenant that God had with Abraham, is ambiguous, inconsistent, and doesn't really make a lot of sense. That's the concept as presented in the Bible. And I will then compare that with how this very same concept is detailed in a clear and a consistent way in the Qur'an. So I'll start with the Bible and then we'll move to the Qur'an. My focus will be actually on the Qur'an, and we will see shortly why we don't really need to stop for long at what the Bible says. And I will be, as usual, use some kind of forensic analysis of Quranic verses and make some comparisons with their biblical counterparts. To start with the Bible, the concept, the covenant with Abraham is repeated many times, in particular in the book of Genesis, the first book in the Hebrew Bible. It's first mentioned in chapter 12 of Genesis, and that's when Abraham at the time was just 75 years old, and we're told that he was instructed by God to leave Haran, which is believed to be today's Haran, or in the southeast of Turkey, and go to Canaan in Palestine. And then in Genesis 11, actually, the chapter before that, it speaks about Abraham as being originally from Ur of the Chaldeans. And that's believed to be the city of Nasiriyah in the south of Iraq today. Anyway, in chapter 12 of Genesis, we're told that God made this covenant with Abraham and told him that would he make him a great nation, bless him, and give the land, that's the land of Canaan, to his offspring. Then in Genesis 13, while he is in Canaan now, this kind of covenant promise is repeated again, that the land will belong to his offspring forever, and his offspring will be as numerous as the dust of the earth. Genesis 15 again mentioned it, and then we get to Genesis 16 when we have Hagar, his slave wife, having conceived and given birth to his son. Abram, as he was called at the time, was 86 years old. And then we come to chapter 17, and I would like to quote what chapter 17 says about the covenant, and specifically because it's actually quite detailed and it contains a lot of information that we will need in our comparison with what the Qur'an says. And this is what the Bible says, and this comes from Genesis chapter 17, verses 1 to 10. And this is God talking to Abraham here. Walk before me and be blameless. Meaning he's telling Abraham to remember that he's always under God's watchful eyes, and he ordered him to be blameless, as to be straight, to be righteous. And then goes on to say, you shall be the ancestor of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. For I have made you the ancestor of a multitude of nations. The change here is that Abraham, the name, means the ancestor is exalted, whereas Abraham, as the Bible says, means the ancestor of multitudes. Then it goes on to say, I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you nations, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring. So between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land where you are now an alien, all the land of Canaan, for a perpetual holding, and I will be their God. And then it says, God said to Abraham, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. So that's Genesis 17, 1 to 10. At the time of this speech by God to Abraham, he was still childless from Sarah, but had a child with Hagar. And one thing you notice here is that the covenant is unconditional. There is no clear condition other than at the beginning, on the part of Israelites. At the beginning, he told Abraham to remember that he's being seen by God all the time, and to be blameless, and so to be righteous. And it's perpetual for both the people and for the land. So the people, the covenant is perpetual with people, and their ownership of the land is also everlasting. And now there is no reason given here why the covenant was made, nothing. And Abraham does not actually ask why, as in why him. And the other thing to notice is that the covenant was ultimately with Isaac. So it's Isaac, that particular grandson, with whom the covenant was ultimately made, and to whose descendants God was going to give the land, the promised land, the land of Canaan. Now, let me stop there and make a little bit of discussion kind of discuss the difference in the covenant that was made with Abraham and the covenant that was made with the Israelites. Of course, it's the same covenant, but applies to both of them. Now, usually the discussion surrounds the fact that, or the biblicist, the way they defend this covenant, they say that it's random, but God can choose whatever he likes. And there's no issue with that. Yes, even in the Qur'an, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَفْعَلُ مَا يُرِيدُ. Allah does whatever he wants. And by definition, really, the only God in this world, the God who can have power over everything, can do whatever he likes. There's no issue there. There's no issue with him choosing Abraham. However, as you would have seen, he actually told Abraham to remember that he is being watched by God all the time. And he ordered him to be blameless. And what's interesting about that, it's not only that he ordered him to be righteous, to behave properly, but to be blameless. So he has to be outwardly as well, completely free of any sin, of any blame. And the reason, because he's going to become a leader of this nation, and then everybody will look up to him. And obviously he has to be an example. So yes, the election was random, let's say. We don't know why Abraham. Let's call it random. It isn't, but let's call it random from our point of view. But once he's chosen him, he told him what he wanted him to be like. It wasn't just any person he could be and the covenant would be with him. No. And that is the main problem in the concept of covenant, because it's applied also to the Israelites. Now, the problem with that is that the Israelites were never, and will never be like Abraham. They are a mixed group of people. They have the good, they have the bad. Yet, the concept is being applied to this whole nation in the same way it was applied to the single person, the righteous person, the leader of that nation, Abraham. Now let me read a quote from the Bible again on this particular point. This time I'm quoting from the book of Deuteronomy, and this comes from Deuteronomy 9:4-7. This is what it says. When the Lord, your Lord, thrust them out before you, talking to Israel the nation, do not say to yourself, it's because of my righteousness that the Lord has brought me in to occupy the land. Not because of that. It's rather because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is dispossessing them before you. So it's talking about the evil nations that were in Canaan and how God is taking the land from them, giving the land to the Israelites. It is not, again, it's repeated again, it's not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart that you are going in to occupy their land, but because of the wickedness of these nations, the Lord your God is dispossessing them before you, in order to fulfill the promise that the Lord made on oath to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Know then that the Lord your God is not giving you the land, the good land to occupy because of your righteousness. Just notice the repetition here, the focus on this point. For you are a stubborn people. Remember and do not forget how you provoked the Lord your God to wrath in the wilderness. You have been rebellious against the Lord from the day you came out of the land of Egypt until you came to this place. Pretty damning statement by God about those early Israelites. But that is a big problem here. As I mentioned, the choosing of Abraham may have been random, let's call it random, but he imposed on him the condition of being righteous, and Abraham delivered that. So you understand fully why the covenant was established with him. But then here we have a completely different situation. The passage, when you look at it, seems to try to explain why the Israelites were chosen, just to end up explaining, giving no explanation. So effectively saying, well, those nations in Canaan are evil, so I'm going to get rid of them. But then the question is, really what this whole passage is about, and big chunk of the book, is why the Israelites? There is actually no explanation. Now, one might ask, well, the authors, editors of the Bible could have come up with anything. No, they could not, because they had history to write. And that history cannot be fully falsified. They had history, they had to talk about what went on, the repeated acts of rebellion, the number of people who were not following God's commands, etc., all of that. So they found themselves in this situation. They had to apply this covenant to themselves as well, the way they understood it, and then try to explain it, just to end up giving absolutely no explanation whatsoever. So Abraham's choosing Abraham is justified by virtue of what Abraham became and what the kind of righteous person he was, but there is no explanation for choosing Israel as a whole nation. And it's a problem here, because the whole point about God is that God is moral. God has moral values and has commandments and all of that. Yet here we have the only thing that's recognized is the evilness of the nations that were occupying Palestine, Canaan at the time, and but there's nothing to justify choosing the Israelites. And so what we could conclude is that actually the covenant makes, the term covenant makes sense only in the case of Abraham. In the case of Israel, it's a gift. It's not actually a covenant. There's nothing. They're not giving any. They're not asked to give anything in return. So they can be as bad as they are, or they have been. They can commit genocide. They can be rebellious against God. They can do whatever they like, but the land is theirs. God is theirs, and the covenant, what they call covenant, is there. So what happened here is a covenant that is usually, by definition, bilateral, was turned into a gift, and for that matter, nonsensical unilateral covenant. There's an assumption always that the assumption is that the Bible is an account of how God created history using the nation of Israel. That's another way of saying the Bible is the history of the chosen people of God. So the reality, however, is that the Bible is the story of how Israel used God to write its ethnocentric history. That's the reality of the Bible. So I think we've had enough talking about the covenant in the Bible. Let's move to the Qur'an, and let's see how things will make a lot more sense. Now, the Qur'an, as everybody knows, is very brief when it comes to history. It's much smaller book than the Bible anyway. Yet, as brief as it is, it's amazingly rich with information if you try and start to analyze what it says, cross-reference one part with another. Suddenly you find the Quran telling you so much more than you expected. The Quran is particularly, you find particularly able to correct the theology and the history that you read in the Bible. It does this brilliantly. On top of that, it actually helps us to recover lost history. By reading what the Quran says about what really happened, we can actually work out episodes of history that had gone missing, were not recorded for one reason or another, in addition to, of course, correcting distorted history. And what I've just said applies to the covenant with Abraham in the same way it applies to many other historical and theological concepts and accounts in the two scriptures. The Quran helps us make sense of things. The biblical history, because of its ethnocentric nature, is very, very difficult to make sense of. And finally, I would like to say here that while we're going to deal with quite a few verses about Abraham, who's called Ibrahim, of course, in the Quran, we are not going to cover everything about this great, great prophet. We will focus really mainly on verses that are kind of relevant to the subject of covenant, which is what we are talking about here. There's one particular verse that I would like to call the verse, the covenant verse, because this is where the covenant, God's covenant, Allah's covenant with Ibrahim is mentioned. The verse reads as follows: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وإذ ابتلى إبراهيم ربه بكلمات فأتمهن قال إني جاعلك للناس إماما قال ومن ذريتي قال لا ينال عهدي الظالمين. It may be translated as, and when Abraham was tried by his Lord with commands and he fulfilled them, he said, that's God said, indeed I will make you a leader for people. He said, that's Abraham, and of my descendants, so he was asking. Then God replies, my covenant does not include the wrongdoers. This is from chapter Al-Baqarah, chapter number 2, and the verse is verse 124. I am going to analyze this verse in detail. I'll split it into 5 parts. As short as it is, it will be easier to do it this way, and you'll see how much information we can actually extract out of this very short verse. The 5 parts are these. And when Abraham was tried by his Lord with commands, so this is talking about some revelation, and then it goes on to say, and he fulfilled them, so the fulfillment of Abraham of those commands. Then we have the covenant itself, where God says, I will make you a leader for people. Then that third part, the fourth part, is when Abraham makes a request, when he says, and of my descendants, so you're going to make also leaders of them. And then the last part is Allah's reply to this request, which restricts the covenant, as he says, my covenant does not include the wrongdoers. So let's start with the first part of the verse, which is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and when Abraham was tried by his Lord with commands. And the first thing that comes to mind here is, what's that? Where are these commands, and what are these commands? Now, we're given in the Quran examples of things Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said to Ibrahim, ordered him to do, and how he responded. But really, there's a broader concept here we're talking about, which is the fact that Abraham received the revelation, obviously, but actually Abraham received what is described in the Quran as a form of book, a divine book, revelation. Twice the Quran mentions something called Suhuf Ibrahim. Suhuf is a plural of sahifa. Sahifa means page, sheet. So Suhuf Ibrahim means sheets, things that, pages, written pages. And this same expression, like I say, occurs twice, and it is applied in both cases when it describes Abraham's Suhuf Ibrahim. It also mentions Suhuf Musa, so Moses. So talking about effectively at least part of the Torah, Kitab, the book of Moses. And I'm going to look now at the two places where those suhuf, those sheets of Abraham are mentioned. The first of them, the first one, occurs in chapter number 53, An-Najm, or the chapter of the star. And I'm not going to read the whole passage, but I'm going to say, just give the kind of how it starts. In Arabic starts, أم لم ينبأ بما في صحف موسى وإبراهيم الذي وفى. It starts as, or has he not been informed of what was in the suhuf of Moses and of Abraham, who fulfilled his obligations. So he's talking about the the disbelievers, and why a disbeliever would not, has he not heard of, etc. It's a rhetorical kind of a question. What's interesting, though, is that after mentioning the suhuf of Moses and then of Ibrahim, the Quran goes on to say what these suhuf, what these sheets or pages said. And there are a variety of things that are mentioned. It talks about the concept of personal responsibility. So it talks about, for instance, there is no, that's mentioned in there, that no bearer of burdens will bear the burden of another, which is لا تزر وازرة وزر أخرى in Arabic. Also it says أن ليس للإنسان إلا ما سعى, and that the human has nothing but what he works for, and that his effort will be seen, that then he will be recompensed for it with the fullest recompense, and that to your Lord is the end. So this is about the hereafter. And that it is he who causes laughing and weeping, so causes someone to laugh or weep, and that it is he who causes death and gives life, and that he created males and females from a drop, etc., and that it is on him the other creation, so it's his responsibility then to recreate everything, everybody, on the day of resurrection. And that it is he who enriches and gives satisfaction to people, and that is he is the Lord of mentions one particular star, Cyrus. So that's what it talks about, quite detailed, a lot of details. After mentioning Suhuf Musa and Ibrahim, the Suhufs of Musa, the pages of Musa and Ibrahim, it goes on then to talk about that. That is the first mention of this book of Ibrahim in chapter 53. The second place where this term is also mentioned is in chapter 87, called Al-A'la, or the Most High. And here it starts actually the verse, the chapter, it's 19 verses, and the last two verses goes something like this: إن هذا لفي الصحف الأولى صحف إبراهيم وموسى. Indeed, this is in the earliest suhuf, or sheets or leaves, the suhuf of Abraham and Moses. So these are the two places where it's mentioned. Now, I would like to just kind of mention something I observed about those two places. In the case of chapter 53, An-Najm, the star, the suhuf, the sheets, are mentioned, and then the description of what they contained follows. In the case of chapter 87, it is actually the other way round. So what you have is that the chapter starts by describing things there, and then it ends with mention of the suhuf. Let me read what this chapter is. Not very long. I'm going to read it in English. People can refer to it in Arabic. But exalt the name of your Lord, the Most High, who created and proportioned, and who destined so. He guided, and who brings out the pasture, then makes it dried, dust-colored. It goes on. So remind if reminding should benefit. He who fears, meaning Allah, who fears Allah, will remember, and the wretched one will avoid it, will avoid listening. He who will be burned in the greatest fire, in which he does not die or live. And goes on to say, indeed, this is in the early suhuf, sheets or leaves, the suhuf of Ibrahim and Musa. So, as I mentioned earlier, in the first chapter, in chapter 53, you have the description of what's in the suhuf following the mention of the suhuf, whereas in chapter 87 is the other way around. So you've got the mention of the suhuf follows the content of what's in there, or some of the contents in there. And again, you can see a number of topics covered there. The concept of Allah being the creator, the doer of everything, that he knows everything. He will. There's a day of judgment, that he will judge everybody. The day of judgment is eternal. He's the Lord who punishes and who rewards, etc. All of that. Of course, the Qur'an says that the religion of Abraham, was Islam, the same religion of Jesus, of Muhammad, sallallahu ta'ala alayhim jami'an wa sallam, and all other prophets. One other actual observation I should make about these two places is that in the first case, in the case of chapter 53, there are 17 verses that follow the mention of suhuf, that talk about what those suhuf or leaves contained. In the case of the other chapters, 87, there are 17 verses preceding the mention of suhuf. Beautiful symmetry. So in the first example, the first chapter, the suhuf are mentioned, then what they contain. In the in chapter 87 is the other way around. The content are mentioned first, and then the suhuf are mentioned. But another kind of remarkable symmetry is the fact that it's 17 verses in both cases that talk about the content or subjects or topics or concepts covered in those suhuf. Of course, this is not meant to be that the only content, because it's talking about suhuf Musa as well, but talking about these issues or concepts or information mentioned in these. Now, if you look at the content of both of these, of the suhuf according to these two chapters, only and only on the basis of these two, we don't need any more information. We can right away say that Abraham's religion was different to Judaism and Christianity. And in fact, there is obviously a number of verses in the Qur'an that talk about that. One of them is ما كان إبراهيم يهوديا ولا نصرانيا ولكن كان حنيفا مسلما وما كان من المشركين. It says Abraham was neither a Jew nor a Christian, but he was a Hanif Muslim, and he was not one of the polytheists. This is from Al-Imran, chapter number 3, verse 67. So this is a verse that clearly says he wasn't Christian or a Jew. But if you look at the content of the Suhuf that are mentioned in those two chapters, you will see at least, well, I'm going to pick on two themes actually to show how they set his religion aside from Christianity and Judaism. There's a mention of the day of resurrection. This is missing in the Bible. The day of resurrection is a really major theme in the Quran. In the Bible, it does not exist. I mean, it's mentioned in probably the book of Daniel later. It's a very late book, but actually the whole book is void of this concept. This is the exact opposite of what you find in the Quran. Now, the Quran says that this was mentioned in the Suhuf of Ibrahim. The Bible has nothing to do with the Suhuf of Ibrahim. It has nothing left of the Suhuf Ibrahim, very little possibly. Definitely not these major themes. What about Christianity? How do these two chapters kind of differentiate Abraham's religion of Islam from Christianity as it was developed after Jesus? Well, they talk about personal responsibility and the fact that no one can bear the sin of another, and no person can redeem another, which is, as you know, the doctrine of redemption and the concept of original sin, of course, underline Christianity. These are both rejected in the verses that describe what the suhuf, the sheets, the leaves, the pages, the books of Abraham contained. In the previous verse that I cited, there was the term Hanif. That's mentioned there, and I left it in its form in Arabic when I read it, in English as well. But let me just comment on it quickly. The term, because it's an important term in the Quran. The term Hanif occurs 12 times in the Quran. 7 of these 12 occurrences describe Abraham. In 9 of the 12, the term is used in direct contrast to polytheism. In one other place, it's used in an indirect way, again, to contrast Hanif with polytheism, because in that it's talking about dedication to Allah. In the context of talking about dedication to Allah, it uses the term Hanif. And there is one instance where the religion of Abraham is described directly as Hanif. That's his religion. And in one other place, it used to refer to al-fitra, that concept in the Quran, which means innate or natural disposition, inclination, the way we are created, and which we may decide to override with our own behavior. So we are created as Muslims, as in naturally inclined to surrender to our Lord. But we go out of our way to override that fitra, that innate, natural disposition, and some of us anyway behave differently. Let's look further at what the Quran told us about the book of Abraham. That book is actually, all the descriptions that were cited there are all creedal, all concepts to do with faith, belief about God being the creator. There's a day of judgment, how we should be righteous in behaving in this world, obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's all really creedal. There are no descriptions of any kind of detailed legal kind of instructions there. That is really very interesting because it's very consistent with another verse in the Quran. The consistency of the Quran is just beautiful. This is the verse I'm talking about. كل الطعام كان حلا لبني إسرائيل إلا ما حرم إسرائيل على نفسه من قبل أن تنزل التوراة. All food was lawful to the children of Israel except what Israel had made unlawful to himself before the Torah was sent down. This is from Al-Imran, number 93, so it's chapter 3. So what you see here, now, of course, Israel was the grandson of Abraham, so he would have known about the revelations that were given to his grandfather, this great prophet. But clearly, Israel had, as in Jacob, of course, that's his first name, before it was changed to Israel. Jacob actually did not have any kind of detailed instructions that he inherited from Abraham to follow in terms of what to eat, what not to eat. So he had actually to come up with his own, but that would have been, of course, with some instruction, subtle instruction, probably by Allah, we don't know. But the point here I'm trying to make is that how this verse that describes Jacob's need, Israel's need, to impose on himself or kind of designate unlawful food, how this is completely consistent with the descriptions given of the Suhuf of Ibrahim, the book of Ibrahim, that contained no kind of detailed legal information there. So, what to conclude here? Well, we can easily conclude that, and we know that Judaism and accordingly Christianity are both ignorant of the book of Ibrahim. Judaism and Christianity do not know that Prophet Abraham, their prophet, had a book, had certain revelations. And that's kind of understandable. Think about it. The Bible probably was written down in the second half of the first millennium BCE. That's around over 1,000 years later than Abraham, because Abraham lived, it's generally kind of considered that he lived in the first half of the second millennium BCE. We have no direct evidence, by the way, about him, just to make this clear. So there's no record, archaeological, historical, scriptural, whatever, as in scriptural, as in written, sorry, not, I don't mean religious scriptures, to mention him independent of the Bible and other later writings. So what should we conclude from this? We should conclude that when the editors, writers of the Bible came to write it down, they were ignorant of the reality of Abraham's covenant. They did not know what that book, what the revelation was given to Abraham contained. The whole concept does not exist, and we should conclude then they missed a lot and did not know a lot about Abraham's religion. So we know why. From what the Qur'an tells us, they did not know Islam, the religion of Islam, that Abraham's religion was Islam. And also their concept of chosenness is completely also skewed. It's incorrect. Let's go back now to the verse of covenant. We started first with the first part, which is we talked about وَإِذِ ابْتَلَى إِبْرَاهِيمَ رَبُّهُ بِكَلِمَاتٍ, and when Abraham's Lord tested him or tried him with certain commands, and then that was the second part of the verse. The first part. The second part is فَأَتَمَّهُنَّ, which means he fulfilled them. So clearly what the Quran is talking about, the verse, is that there was some kind of demand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made, some conditions, some requirements he wanted from Abraham. And Abraham delivered everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked of him. Which is why after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions those demands, he goes on to say, فَأَتَمَّهُنَّ, he fulfilled them. And the term that's used there, ibtala in Arabic, means tried. So you try something with something difficult, you say ibtala. And what's interesting, and going back to the beautiful subject of the consistency of the Quran, we find Abraham described in another place as Ibrahim alladhi waffa, Abraham who fulfilled his obligations. See the beauty. This comes from a completely different chapter, so I think it's from which, if I don't know that I've got. I think it's a verse 53:37. That's where it comes from. Ibrahim alladhi waffa, who fulfilled. So this comes from a completely different chapter to the chapter that contains the verse of covenant. Moving on to the third part of the covenant verse, now we come to the covenant itself. This is where قال إني جاعلك للناس إماما. He said, as in Allah, indeed, I will make you a leader for people. The covenant here, and this is really important, comes as a result of Abraham fulfilling the demands, the conditions, the requirements that Allah made of him. It was not, it may have been, somebody may call it random choice of Abraham to start with. It is not random confirmation of that choice and giving covenant to Abraham, because this man, this special man, fulfilled everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked of him. And that's why the covenant in the case of Abraham makes full sense. And that's why the covenant in the case of Israel as a whole nation makes absolutely no sense, because there is nothing in reciprocation. There's no similar statement that can be made about the nation of Israel. If anything, the Israelites are actually repeatedly criticized in the Bible itself. If anything, they're even criticized for killing prophets. That's not, by the way, something mentioned in the Quran alone. I think it's mentioned 6-7 times in the Quran, but it's actually mentioned at least 3 times in the Hebrew Bible and also in the New Testament. And in one case, I think it was Jesus criticizing them. If my memory hasn't failed me. So the other word to just mention quickly is imam. Imam means leader, as like, leader of people in general. Leader, somebody who leads a group of congregation in a prayer, called imam as well. That's where it comes from. So it's the person who's in the front and who is followed by everyone else. The other term that I would like to draw attention to in this covenant, قال إني جعلك للناس إماما, for people, not for anyone specific, for people. Abraham was made a prophet and a leader for everybody. Now, some people might have benefited more from him, some certain nations more than others. But that was not Allah's choice to make him only a leader for some people, but not for another. Allah is not focused on any ethnicity. That's not the definition of Allah. So, that was the covenant, which is part 3 of the verse. And then we move on to part 4. And part 4 is, part 4 reports what Abraham said after he heard what Allah told him about the covenant. And he said, قَالَ وَمِن ذُرِّيَّتِي, he said, and of my descendants. So with also my descendants, some of them, not all of them. He said, وَمِن ذُرِّيَّتِي, some of my descendants. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala confirmed that, but in a way that he confirmed that some of them, while also saying not all of them. So in part 4 is the request from Abraham that whether it's in the form of question, but it's actually a request. The context is one of request, whether you have question mark or not. And then you can see it's a request, and it's a request, modest request. He's saying some of my descendants, he didn't say everybody. He wasn't talking nations. Remember, this concept, this logic does not exist in the way it exists in the Bible, not in the Qur'an. So we move on then to part 5, where the reply from Allah comes to the request, or if you call it inquiry, from Abraham. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قَالَ لَا يَنَالُ عَهْدِيَ الظَّالِمِينَ. And he went in to say, he said, my covenant does not include the wrongdoers. Straightforward. So the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala kind of replied to Abraham kind of confirmed indirectly as well, yes, some of your descendants will become leaders, will have this covenant, but not the wrongdoers. So what does this tell us about the covenant as far as Israel, the nation, is concerned? There's no such concept. In the Quran, there is no such concept. We saw earlier the Bible itself conceding that the Israelites were rebellious, stubborn, not righteous, you name it. So this ahd, this covenant, according to the Quran, does not cover everybody and does not cover the wrongdoers. So it's a limited, restricted covenant. It continues, but it is limited, restricted. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not going to cover the concept of chosenness of God. This, hopefully, inshallah, I'll have the time to do a separate video on that. So I'm trying to be focused only about the covenant that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made with Abraham. And inshallah, I'll deal with that elsewhere. Now, let me pick another kind of example of the consistency, beautiful consistency of the Quran. Again, from the story of Ibrahim. This verse is from Al-Baqarah, chapter 2, it's verse 126. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. وَإِذْ قَالَ إِبْرَاهِيمُ رَبِّ اجْعَلْ هَذَا بَلَدًا آمِنًا وَارْزُقْ أَهْلَهُ مِنَ الثَّمَرَاتِ مَنْ آمَنَ مِنْهُمْ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ قَالَ وَمَنْ كَفَرَ فَأُمَتِّعَهُ قَلِيلًا ثُمَّ أَضْطَرُّهُ إِلَى عَذَابِ النَّارِ وَبِئْسَ الْمَصِيرُ. May be translated as, and when Abraham said, my Lord, make this a secure city and provide its people with the fruits. This is, by the way, Abraham is speaking in Mecca, because that's where he lived, and he built the Kaaba, which is something that the Quran tells us, and that's part of the what I mentioned, lost history that you do not find in the Bible and elsewhere. And that's actually why you look at the background image showing the Kaaba. It's a beautiful reference to our great grandfather and prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. So Ibrahim said, My Lord, make this a secure city and provide its people with fruits, whoever of them believes in Allah and the last day. Allah said, again, you have similar to what we had earlier in the covenant verse, request by Ibrahim and a response by Allah. The response of Allah is as follows: and whoever disbelieves, I will grant him enjoyment for a little, then I will force him to the punishment of the fire, a wretched destination. Let me stop a little bit at this comparison between what we saw in the verse of covenant and this verse. Now, in the verse of covenant, the speech was about leadership, spiritual leadership. And Ibrahim was asking whether Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would then allow or make some of his descendants as well leaders. He was probably thinking about the need of future generations for leaders. That was not talking ethnically here, remember. He's talking about, because he was the leader, the tawheed, the kind of affirmation of the oneness of Allah was being spread, spoken about, was being kind of, talked about to people, different people. So he wanted that to continue, and that's really the gist of his message. That's what he was asking about, which is why he didn't say everybody. If he was talking kind of just on the whole tribe, as the Bible loves to speak, it speaks about the tribe of Israel all the time, he would have asked for that honor to be conferred on everybody of his descendants. He did not say that. He asked for some. He did. Would it cover in a very nice, polite way? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the course of saying those wrongdoers would not get it, he indirectly confirmed that yes, some of them. Now, when we come to this verse that I've just read, in which Ibrahim asks for kind of food, sustenance, etc., for the people of Mecca when he was living, he asked, look at this, he asked only urzuq ahlahu min al-thamarat man aman. He was asking for fruits, whoever of them believes in Allah and the last day. Only that. But look what Allah said when he replied. In this case, there's a reversal here. Here, Ibrahim asking for something for all people in that place, because that's his people there, but he restricted it to those who believed in Allah. But look how Allah corrected or kind of expanded or widened the concept that or broadened the concept that Ibrahim had in mind, because this is not about spiritual leadership or spiritual gift. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, and whoever disbelieves, I will grant him enjoyment for a little. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala went out of his way to say that even those who don't believe, I will give them, because that's what this world is about. It's not about only those who are spiritual, who are righteous, who are obedient to Allah. It's for everybody. And he's telling Ibrahim, reminding him here, you asked for rizq, sustenance, and security for the people of this place. And he said, yeah, I'll grant them this, but I also actually give those who do not believe. That is because it's a different request, a different kind of gift to the gift of spiritual leadership. Again, I'm trying to highlight consistencies, beautiful consistencies in the Qur'an, and how its message fits. Every verse is one part of the same whole, and the verses support each other, explain each other, or as exegetes, our great traditional exegetes used to say, Al-Qur'an yufassiru ba'dahu ba'da. Al-Qur'an, the Qur'an, interprets itself. There's one other description of Ibrahim I would like to mention because it's relevant. It's not mentioned always in the maybe when the covenant is discussed in that particular verse, but I would like to mention it here. It's one of the verses in which he is described as Hanif, which I mentioned earlier. Hanif something means who steers away from polytheism. So somebody who's muwahhid, who affirms the oneness of Allah. And the verse is from Surah An-Nahl, the bee, which is chapter 16, and it's verse 120. إن إبراهيم كان أمة قانتا لله ولم يكن من المشركين. Indeed, Abraham was an ummah, devoutly obedient to Allah, Hanif, and he was not one of the polytheists. Now, I left in my translation the Arabic word as is, ummah. Everybody who's listening to this probably understands what ummah means. Ummah means nation. It's a very strange description to describe a person as being a nation. I derive the word ummah and the word imam from the same root. So an imam is a leader of an ummah. If you don't have ummah, there is no imam, and you can't have an imam and you don't have an ummah. So there's a link between these two. But why would Abraham himself be described as ummah? It's a bit strange. It's a noun. It's not an adjective, speaking linguistically, to be used in this way. Well, it is actually, there are kind of, at times in the language, you can use a noun to describe a person as a way of providing a superlative description. So you may say, إنه, in Arabic, إنه الجمال, إنه الجمال بعينه. His beauty itself, as if to say, well, he's so beautiful. He is a beauty itself. That's kind of a way of using a noun to describe somebody, to try and describe it in really as superlative a way as you can. But why would he be called Ummah? Ummah because he was the father of prophets. He became the father not only of prophets, of so many prophets. All the prophets that we know of that came after him were his descendants. That's what we know. That's what we know from the Qur'an. And the number of them is actually huge. And even though the Qur'an tells us that the Qur'an did not name or mention all prophets that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent. I'm going to cite another ayah that mentions this specific fact and says, وَلَقَدْ أَرْسَلْنَا نُوحًا وَإِبْرَاهِيمَ وَجَعَلْنَا فِي ذُرِّيَّتِهِمَا النُّبُوَّةَ وَالْكِتَابَ فَمِنْهُمْ مُهْتَدٍ وَكَثِيرٌ مِّنْهُمْ فَاسِقُونَ. And we have already sent Noah and Abraham and placed in their descendants prophethood and the book. So among them is he who's guided, and many of them are rebellious. This is from Surah Al-Hadid, Surah number 657, and it is verse 26. And what's interesting here is that, first of all, you can see the link I made earlier that he's called Ummah because in his descendants, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed prophethood, and that many prophets came out of him. And what's interesting here as well, remember when we spoke about the concept of imam, the spiritual leadership, it's being conditional, restricted, it's not going to cover everybody. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told Ibrahim, the same here. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and we placed prophethood and the book, as in we're going to reveal books. Book is a generic term. So Qur'an is a manifestation of the book, Bible, the Torah, the Injil, Zabur, Suhuf, Ibrahim. These are all manifestations or forms of the generic concept of book. So what you have here is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying that even though He placed prophethood and the book in the progeny, in the offspring of Abraham and Noah, He says, فَكَثِيرٌ مِّنْهُمْ فَاسِقُونَ, many of them are rebellious. So it's, as you can see, its conditions not going to cover everybody. Completely understandable. Let me now make another comparison between this particular verse and a verse in Genesis. The verse in Genesis is 17:6. And it says, and this is, remember in the quote we had earlier, the detailed, long kind of quote, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was talking to Abraham about the covenant, and He said to him, I will make nations of you. I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. Very, very interesting. Again, compare this verse from the Bible with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said about Ibrahim in the Qur'an. The focus of the Qur'an is on prophethood in his descendants and the book, whereas the focus in the Bible is kings. Why? Because kings, this is what the Bible is about. Those are the kings who are going to make Israel, the nation, supreme. It's going to make it occupy all of Palestine. It's going to give them the land. It's going to protect them, etc. This is what the Bible cares about. This is another example of what I call lost history and distorted theology. The covenant is focused, or in this particular case, the description Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is making is about the most valuable thing that made Abraham a great father. Not the kings that came after him from his blood. No, it's the fact that his descendants were prophets. Some of them were prophets, and some of them also had books revealed to them. See the difference? Again, just same concept. Ethnocentric Bible and divine Qur'an. Qur'an that focuses on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Lord, and how the servant, everybody must respond to their Lord and deal with him and be obedient to him. And what the Bible says, which is basically focusing on what kind of distinguishes the Israelites, the nation of Israel, and give them more privileges. That's what the Bible is about. Now, accordingly and completely understandably, the Quran then goes on to say, Inna awla nas, and this very important verse, as every verse, Inna awla nas bi Ibrahim, إن أولى الناس بإبراهيم للذين اتبعوه وهذا النبي والذين آمنوا والله ولي المؤمنين. Indeed, the people who are most worthy of Abraham are those who followed him. So talking about those in the past. And this prophet, referring to Muhammad sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam, and those who believe, as in the people who believed with Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Of course, that would have included Christians and Jews as well, by the way. So this is the one say, those alladhina amanu, alladhina, everybody who believed then the last prophet who came to confirm, and in fact at times clarifies history, etc., that went on before him. And goes on to say, and Allah is the ally of the believers. And this is chapter Al-Imran, chapter number 3, verse 68. So it isn't kind of about the Jews, let's say, or the Israelites, even in the past, were kind of closer to Ibrahim. just by virtue of being his descendants. Well, I mean, anybody from Ishmael can say as well, we are his descendants. But that's not the sense of belonging in the Quran that matters. Is the spiritual connection, spiritual belonging that actually makes sense, not being the son of so-and-so. That's not what matters. Now, what's interesting is because the New Testament, now I'm kind of moving from the Hebrew Bible to the New Testament, because the New Testament also is universal, as I spoke about in a previous video, in its message is universal. It's not ethnocentric like the Hebrew Bible. You see this actually in a similar kind of, not similar, but in a particular situation where John the Baptist is talking to the Pharisees and Sadducees who came for baptism. They came to him to be baptized, and he tells them, do not presume to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our ancestor. For I tell you, God is able for these stones to raise up children for Abraham. And that's Matthew 3, 5 to 9, the whole passage. And I think it occurs in another gospel. Now, so what you can see here is kind of the sense is similar. To kind of link yourself to Ibrahim on the basis of blood. The blood connection is meaningless. It doesn't count. Not in Allah's eyes. No, that's not the connection. The connection is by following him. So when it says, those who, in the Quran says, the people who are most worthy of Abraham are those who followed him. Again, the concept is following him, not whether they were actually his descendants or not. We can be sure that some people who were not his descendants also accepted his message at the time. So he's talking about those who followed him. And this prophet, remember, Muhammad is being identified not as somebody from a descendant of Abraham. No, he's being actually identified as a prophet. So somebody who carried the message. Somebody who is included in the verse that described described what's going to happen to the kind of when the verse that said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was going to place prophethood and the book in the descendants of Abraham. So that's a reference to the prophet. And the third category of people, and those who believe. And those who believe, like I said at the time, could have been anybody. And a lot of them were not actually necessarily Arabs. There are people who traveled from other parts of the surrounding Arabia at the time, etc., came and accepted the message of the Prophet sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam, and by doing that became followers of Ibrahim. And they were closer to Ibrahim spiritually in the sense of his teachings than the Jews and the Christians who refused and rejected the confirming message that Muhammad received from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, confirming what the original revelation to Ibrahim. So let me conclude just quickly. The concept of the biblical covenant, the concept of covenant to Abraham in the Bible, and then which was extended to the Israelites, is rather ambiguous and inconsistent. You find the exact opposite in the Quran. The covenant is described in a very clear, consistent, and coherent way. It makes full sense. This was an illustration of what I mentioned earlier, how the Quran corrects theology and history in the Bible, and how it also helps us recover lost history. Thank you for watching. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.